Oh, thank you all so much. Thank you for coming today. Yeah, I mean, coming here, I mean, metaphorically, but we are all in one room together, and I appreciate that. Today, we have our third presenter in our series for inclusive pedagogy. Our speaker today, our presenter, is named Julie Hochgesang. I would also like to first do a land acknowledgement. We are here based in Chicago, and we want to acknowledge the ancestral lands, pay our respects to the historical relationship that tribes have with the land that continues today. We want to acknowledge let me start again, the Miami, Illinois, and Potawatomi tribes. So as I said today, we have Julie presenting, and Julie saying, this is my sign name if you prefer. She's an associate professor at Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. Her focus is on language documentation and accessibility in the general community and how to make linguistics better. She's worked on various different projects. She's done amazing work. She's worked on documenting various sign language, such as American Sign Language, Hindi Sign Language. She works in phonology as well. And she also manages the ASL Sign Bank. And that is such an amazing project. I can't say enough about that. And I think that it started at the Gallaudet Documentation Project. Was that last year or 2 years ago? Julie is saying, yeah, it's been within the last 2 years, but last year, good enough, close enough. So we are so happy that she could join us today. We have a wonderful presenter, and we're very excited to have you here, Julie. So our plan for the day is to have Julie's pre-recorded presentation shown. We will all first watch the pre-recording, and when that's finished, we'll have a question and answer period. And for the question and answer portion, if you wouldn't mind to either physically raise your hand, use the raise hand function, or type your question in the chat, any of those 3 ways so that we know to acknowledge you and address any questions or comments you might have. And so today, this is a pre-recorded presentation that we're showing. However, there will also be a recording available on our website next week, which we can disseminate to everyone. And then we also, before we get started, there will be certain slides that have amounts of text that Julie will ask you to read. If you need access to that visual text, please chat me directly, send me a message, and then we can make sure that we will provide voiced interpretation for those portions if anyone needs access in that way, okay? There will also be some embedded videos with sign language in them, with Julie signing. So, it will be best for everyone if you have your screen set up to full, and hopefully that will enable you to see Julie's image at the maximum viewing capability. Okay, well, that's all I have for now. I think we are ready to start the presentation. All right, I'm so excited. We're so happy you're here, Julie. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I would like to give a brief disclaimer. Due to the pandemic, we're doing everything remotely. I am a remote learner, a remote parent. I'm working full-time. My whole family is doing everything under one roof, and our lives have been upended. Also, as a deaf person, it's not been easy for me to give a live presentation with interpreters. And I thought the best option would be to provide you with a pre-recording that the interpreters could add a voiceover to. And then we would be able to watch, and I would join you live for a Q&A. Of course, that was my plan. And when you make plans, life oftentimes has other plans. I have a child right now who's having a meltdown in between trying to record this presentation and get everything together. It really just hasn't been easy for me. So I thank you in advance for your empathy, as well as your patience and bearing with my format, and if it seems as though my attention is divided. This may not be a video that has slick production values, as some people who may have the time and resources is to have done that. So thank you for your understanding.
My name is Julie Hochgesang. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. I'm here today to talk about the inclusion of deaf people and signed languages in linguistics. I would like to start with the utmost gratitude to the Linguistics Department at the University of Chicago for inviting me to present and partake in this amazing workshop series on inclusion. I'm following two amazing scholars, Kendra Calhoun and Wesley Leonard, both of whose work has had such a profound impact on me. It's an honor to follow their presentations. In 2019, at the Georgetown University Roundtable, I was privileged to present on a panel with the next speaker of the series, Kirby Conrad. At the aforementioned panel, Nick Subterleru hosted it, and he really problematized what real linguistics means, much like Wesley Leonard, who pointed out that linguistics with the big L is not linguistics with the lowercase l. I appreciate this time and space I've been given today to represent the signing deaf communities. Of course, I'm not the first to talk about this. There are people, deaf academics, who talk about deaf academics and inclusion of signed deaf experiences in the different fields of study. Today, I'd like to introduce some of these things. What you'll see in the following slides are 3 ASL signs: include, involve, deaf, and linguistics. Why include sign languages in the study of linguistics? Well, the better question is, why not? If linguists study human languages, sign languages are an important part of that domain. It's been 80 years of research, and they have amply demonstrated that signed languages, just like speech, is a modality suited to the primary experience of human language. To exclude this modality of sign languages is to miss a part of the whole story. There's persistent misconceptions and active efforts to suppress sign languages for many reasons. Not to mention that signing communities are much smaller, making it difficult to bring equal footing to that of spoken languages. And of course, when thinking about inclusion, we have to consider its other facets. Allow me to explain. Today, I will consider what inclusion means, building on earlier presentations in this workshop series. Let's consider current practices in linguistics and how they could be more inclusive of deaf signing communities. But let us also consider current practices in deaf communities, such as deaf academia, and how they can be included in linguistics. When the University of Chicago Linguistics Department invited me to present today, I started to consider what inclusion means. Okay, so to include means to make something a part of, okay? But also you have to make space for who's included. Okay, so I considered what all of this meant. Fortunately, I was able to see both scholars who preceded me, and I'd like to take a moment to discuss what struck me in their presentations. I'm going to show you a quote from Leslie Leonard, and I'll ask you to go ahead and read it. I won't sign it at the same time or have the interpreter's voice. This is actually a sighted deaf practice that I'll be doing. Sign languages require that visual attention, but consider it also competes with the visual activity of reading. Acknowledging this interactive reality and encouraging you to consider this going forward when you have deaf participants at your presentations, I'll follow the custom of deaf academia and give you time as a participant to read before I sign. Great. So I would like to highlight the lower portion. Okay, regarding inclusion, specifically the not paying attention to their particular ways of knowing, or in my case, I'd like you to consider being. You can't just bring in a body and expect that inclusion be ticked off. No, you have to consider my ways of being. And this is important as we consider the rest of this presentation today. And besides, I just practice that by pointing out to you how I'll wait for you to read the slide before I continue signing, as an example. The next quote is from Kendra Calhoun. Go ahead and take a moment to read it. So I'd like to highlight a couple of things here. Intentionality, what it means, as well as specificity. People's experiences in these spaces differ based on their identities, their lived experiences, maybe even their areas of study. There is no one size fits all solution. Finally, as well as my own experiences as a deaf person, I'll get to that shortly, I also wanted to include that of my colleagues. I spoke about this for the first time at the GERTS 2019 panel, which I mentioned briefly in the opening. The panel was on diversifying linguistics, and I created this Google form for that to collect information from my colleagues, about 40 of which replied, and I'll include that in today's presentation. Now, I'd like to show you the video in which I scan through this Google form. The intention is not for you to read the text itself, please note. This is actually revealing how I use technology. This format allows me to take advantage of the multimodal resources. In this online format, I'm able to represent information in different ways. I use written English text, emojis. I can also link videos of ASL, use animated GIFs, and I'm able to use also both text and signing. As a deaf person, I have the freedom daily to take advantage of the multimodal resources. And I'd like to present this to you today. So I'd like to take a moment, just a brief pause here. The more general theme that all the presentations have had is that there's incredibly rich diversity in language communities, spoken, sign, written, felt, in the case of tactile systems. At any time we want to focus on inclusion in the world, space must be made to ensure the leader of the discussion comes from that particular community. For this particular part of the human experience, the deaf sign experience, this is the world that I live in. So I'm going to take you along with me for a bit of what I experience. This is drawn from my own experiences, the Google forum, the linguistics literature, and what people say on Twitter. Again, to build on the presentations in this series so far, you'll see that there are parallel experiences in signing deaf communities. I'll help you acknowledge them and include them going forward. Of course, with any social identity, there is no label that is all encompassing or each social identity homogeneous. So here, there's no single deaf experience or community. Instead, we have shared aspects of the community. These shared aspects can come out of lived experiences. I'll talk about that in a bit. So our lived experiences can shape our discussion about what it means to be inclusive. And again, this does not mean just including the bodies, but acknowledging and respecting the practices of that community and the ways for being for those who are included. Kendra and Wesley have spoken about in their presentations the importance of clear identity and body positionality. It's important information to consider. Who we are impacts our work and ethics. And this is important to consider when talking about inclusion. The photo to the left is a photo of me at Gallaudet when I was a little girl. If you don't know a bit of the story, that's fine. In this photo, you see a deaf girl. It's me. My family is hearing. I became deaf as a baby. Immediately, when my family found out I was deaf, they began learning sign language. So I went through that process of learning sign language with my family when I was younger. We used to go on a family learning vacation to Gallaudet. This family learning vacation lasted about a week. And at that time, my parents interacted with other deaf families and I would interact with the deaf children. But most importantly, signing deaf adults. It's important to consider that my hearing family encouraged my involvement in the signing community. All of what I said is rooted in my being as a deaf person who signs. So when I say something like, I am a sighted deaf woman from a hearing family, I use American Sign Language and English as my primary languages. This is a phrase that most of you watching today maybe are not familiar with, but it's quite familiar to those in signing deaf communities. I'd like to unpack a few observations rooted in deaf experiences. First, I'll start with deaf signing community. Today, when I'm talking about inclusion of deaf communities and signed languages, I'm referring to specifically the signing communities in North America. As you'll see in this photo here, Gallaudet University which is a liberal arts university in DC, is just an example of a signing community. Most people who go to work there or go to school there sign, and many of them are deaf. During my time at Gallaudet, which has been since 2005, when I entered as a graduate student, and I've been in the linguistics department the whole time, we don't just focus on signed languages in our program at Gallaudet. No, we study on linguistics with the general aim of understanding how all human languages and use data from both spoken and sign languages. Our focus is just like everybody else, human languages. Our research, though, is primarily focused on signed languages. I've taught field methods. Do you see all of these different languages under the screenshot? They're all the languages that I've worked with. Some examples are Italian Sign Language, Japanese Sign Language, Iranian Sign Language, Ho Chi Minh Sign Language, Omani Sign Language. You have Mexican Sign Language and ASL communities. I want you to note that those are the English names for those languages. I'd like to show you the slide because there's a common misassumption in the world that there's only one universal signed language. Most here today know that's not true, just like there's no one universal spoken language. Same thing can be said for signed languages. While we're on the topic, did you notice how I named each signed languages instead of saying sign language generally? It's a common in the literature and obscures the fact that there are over 200 documented signed languages, likely more. I think at this point, the larger issue regarding inclusion applies across the board. Anytime that we reference something, we must be very clear about what we're talking about and using their own terms, then applying the Bender rule. This is similar to what Kendra Calhoun and Wesley Leonard called othering. I'll talk about this a bit later. You may have noticed that one of the languages I mentioned under the field methods collection of photos was ASL communities. Different communities and different varieties. This acknowledges that there's no singular ASL experience, just as there is no singular English variety. When we recognize this, there is no assumption, because there's a tendency to assume a default, like white mainstream English ASL communities. They have their local practice ways of ASL all across the board in different communities, which is again why the Bender rule is important to remember. There are ASL varieties, and some derive from region. For example, the workplace or residential schools for the deaf. Some derive from sociocultural experiences. For example, Black ASL, I'll just say BASL. This book to the left is the first main publication for BASL. There have been more recently. Our research has included better representation of how ASL is actually used across North America. There's also Signing Black in ASL, documentary by the Language and Life Project. It's a beautiful example of inclusion. Because there used to be studied very small populations of deaf people and their communities and their experiences, I'm going to go ahead and show you a quote from Lin Hu, who advocates for more sign languages research to be done. Okay, speaking of ASL communities, most of the work that I do as a linguist is language documentation. And in that work, I'm particularly interested in making our primary data, our signed language use, machine readable, so findable on a computer. To do that, I need to add text annotations. And a part of that work will link our data to be able to find signs more easily upon a machine. For that work, I helped create the ASL Sign Bank, which is an annotation tool. I also share it on social media like Twitter or Instagram. Do you see the hashtags below? That hashtag ASL communities. Anyway, I'd like to briefly point out one inclusive practice that we do there. We make sure all of our content has a visual description for blind users. And a part of this means we describe our signers. If you can see that below the text. I don't determine how each signer identifies themselves, but I've asked each ASL Sign Bank actor to go ahead and tell us their preferred description instead of assuming. And so that's what you'll see in the video description. As I mentioned earlier, I was a sighted deaf woman who uses ASL. Below me in this video clip, this is the use of PTASL, Pro-Tactile American Sign Language ASL, and that's a system that is created by deafblind Americans. As we can see, there's a lot of diversity within the ASL communities. But there's one reoccurring theme, which is, you guessed it, inclusion. I know that's in my presentation, but the idea of inclusion comes up daily in our communities. And that usually refers to access to communication and language for deaf people. Really, access, of course, affects everything we do, including education, healthcare, medical, healthcare again, legal issues, and so on. All across the board, we need access to the language to access those things. It's critical. As you'll see here in this poster or this blog post, it discusses mental health within the deaf community. It's common for, access or inclusion to be assumed as met if sign language interpreting is provided. Like, all done, wipe your hands clean of that. But as this blog suggests, by the title, Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, it's not enough. Like I said, deaf people have seen a lot of supposed inclusion in our lives, especially in education. For example, I'll soon show you a quote from Kristen Snodden in her 2020 paper, which describes several recent human rights complaints brought by Canadian parents of deaf children who couldn't get education in sign language because their deaf school had been closed. And you can read the following.
So there's two important points of emphasis here. The word inclusion requires careful thought without erasure or the denigration of the knowledge that exists within a community. And also, at the same time, when we want to include sign languages, we want to include deaf ecosystems. And that would include knowledge, production of knowledge by deaf people. And we want deaf people and communities involved in that process. Let's see how well we're doing with that in the field of linguistics. So you may recall the Google form that I mentioned earlier that I developed, and I was curious to know about the representation in terms of introductory linguistic courses and the literature in general. Out of 43 respondents, you can see that we're not doing all that well. There are more people who feel there is no representation and fewer people who think there is great representation of deaf people in the field. I completed my undergraduate studies at CSUN University, California State University, Northridge. And although I was an English major, I really fell in love with linguistics and took some introductory courses there. I had a professor who was very thoughtful and intentional about including me. However, when I would access the assigned reading materials, I did not feel that my lived experience as a deaf person was represented. There was an emphasis on speech and audible, vocalized speaking in languages. And if we're going to talk about linguistics as the studies of what human beings do, I didn't feel that I was included in that representation. Another question that was on the Google form was, in terms of general research or publications, I asked how well sign languages are represented. And again, you can see we're not necessarily doing much better than we were with the inclusion in the introductory and the general literature. So when we think about publication and research and including deaf linguists in that process, that's great. But you may have also noticed on the news and on social media that there are a lot of people who develop things to try to help deaf people, such as sign language interpreting gloves, apps, or little bots, things of that nature. Most of those projects, however, are led by hearing people that have no knowledge of sign languages, signing communities, or deaf communities. They simply see deafness as a problem that needs to be fixed. Were deaf people and deaf communities involved in those projects, we'd probably tell them we're not interested in these products. If you'd like to know more, you can look up hashtag disability dongle. So regarding inclusion in linguistics, we can talk about traditional formal academic publishing and conferences. Typically what will happen is that spoken languages and sign languages will be separated based on modality. Sign languages will often have their own special sessions, but they should be included more in the whole of the field of linguistics. Please read this quote. I mentioned this earlier on, the othering or the exoticizing. And again, you can see that that was an issue that both Kendra and Wesley mentioned in their presentations. Unfortunately, we do see that happening in signing communities as well. So in terms of thinking about inclusion in linguistics, there was a discussion on Twitter between two linguists, Bryn Hawk and Jonathan Raclaw. They had an exchange on Twitter, and they've given me their permission to share these tweets with you today. So as you can see from the tweets, there is positive evidence of change in the field. Linguistics is another example where there was a podcast that was filmed with captions added to make it accessible, talking about gesture. And there was another podcast involving Lin Hu, who's a deaf linguist, involving signed languages as well. And I'd like to open the discussion about considering these non-traditional forms of publication in the field. It's easier to disseminate information to a wider audience when we don't simply rely on traditional forms of academic publishing in journals and articles, et cetera. Online platforms also allow a bit of flexibility to make use of those multimodal means of communication, as I mentioned before. Adding pictures, text, GIFs, and everything honors the actual ways of being and ways in which deaf and signing communities utilize language. And I think that there's a way that we can apply that to, again, disseminate information to a wider audience who may not have access to traditional academic means of accessing articles and publications. So really, the acknowledgement of sign languages as an official language in the field of linguistics has still been pretty young. It is important that we include signed languages in the study of languages. And just the mere inclusion is not enough. We can have such a more rich, robust discussion if we include the lived experiences of deaf linguists. There are also other groups of people who are associated with the deaf communities, as well as signing communities, such as CODAs, children of deaf adults, people who have family members who are deaf or spouses who are deaf, or even fluent signers who have associations with deaf and signing communities, whose backgrounds could be included. And those people should also be included in our research and in our study. You're probably familiar with this statement, nothing about us without us. Many different groups have used that statement in order to indicate that there should be no language production or research happening about a particular community without the involvement and representation of people from that specific community leading the way. So you may think, well, sure, of course we should include deaf people in linguistics, of course, but there are some barriers and some thoughts that I would like to share on why this may not be as easy as we think it is. Sign language was only formally recognized in America as a language not too long ago. And the people leading the charge in that way were hearing people. And oftentimes they're hearing people who learned sign language later in life or not at all. I'll talk a little bit more about that here. So here in North America, in the field of linguistics, American Sign Language was recognized due in large part to the work of a man called William Stokoe. He's a hearing white American man who learned ASL as an adult. And you can see a photo here of one of the most prescient publications regarding American Sign Language from a linguist's perspective. And that really changed the game. That did help American Sign Language get the formal recognition as a legitimate language. Please notice the photograph in the bottom of the screen here that shows Stokoe as well as his colleagues Dorothy Casterline and Carl Kronberg. What's interesting about this photo, the context it's important to understand, is that Stokoe went on to publish numerous books, articles, and academic works, while Casterline and Cronenberg faded into the background. Basically, their recognition came as the et al., with Stokoe as the primary author on the works. Please take a moment to read this quote. So including sign languages and deaf lives in the field of linguistics is a non-starter. It's an absolute necessity. Please take a moment to read this quote. I know that's a really long quote, but the last sentence, you know, as we think about inclusion, actually thinking about that fosters the practices that we need to do. So again, easier said than done, but we do need to give that thought so we can get where we need to be. Here's a quote referring to the importance of working with deaf linguists. And this goes back to the fact of inclusion, just not including a person's body, but including their thoughts, their knowledge, their ways of being, and their individual ways of knowing. So yes, deaf linguists do exist. We're out there. There have been more of us within the last 20 years to present. This is just a small representation of deaf linguists in these photos behind me. And this does not include anyone who works in the fields of linguistic anthropology or deaf studies. These are primary linguists. The people who are pictured here on the slide all have PhDs, and they're all affiliated with some academic institution. This information was current as of that Google form from March 2019. There are more deaf linguists in North America and Europe. There's not many people of color. And over half deaf people all over the world don't tend to go on to college or even necessarily get their PhD. All of the people listed here again do have their PhD. For many deaf linguists, in terms of the field work, we're the people who are on the ground. You know, we're not the ones necessarily leading a project. We're conducting those interviews, eliciting, coding, filming. We're not leading projects or publication, and we certainly don't serve as primary authors on publications. There are a few reasons for this, one of which is invisible labor. We do a lot of work that our hearing colleagues don't have to do. For example, we have to secure and schedule our own interpreters. We have to think about accessibility. Today's presentation, for an example, filming this has required a lot of a forethought and coordination. We also have to be our own advocates. I'd like to show you a graph that kind of just embodies how difficult it is for us. So out of the US population, over half of the people do not go on to college, and less than 1% go on to get a PhD. Please take a look at this graph. This is one of the reasons why I share a lot of my content on social media. I add videos, I add captions and visual descriptions, because I know that for many people who want to have access to the deaf linguist community aren't able to access, again, those traditional formats of academic publications, and the internet and social media provides more accessible platforms for people. So here are some more inclusive practices. This is my favorite example. This is regarding Twitter. Please take a look at this Twitter exchange. So the point of a conference is for a person to be able to network. And the networking doesn't happen in the presentation hall. It happens in the hallways during breaks where people can talk about their publications, their projects and grants, but that environment isn't often accessible to deaf people for lack of interpreters. So again, I like to use the social media platforms in order to help level that playing field. And I know that there's a webinar that I filmed in 2020. I can share a link with you about that. Now, in terms of best practices, Adam Schembri here is a linguist. He's also an advocate for deaf scholars. He shared this tweet in 2019, and I know it may be hard for some of you to read, but I will provide a sort of enlarged text for the part that I'd like you to focus on. So this enlarged text says that within the context of being invited to a conference where sign languages were being represented, and yet there were no deaf colleagues there to represent those communities and those languages, Adam decided not to attend. Please read this quote. So even the term speaker, that brings to mind the act of speech, that might be replaced with the term user. And that's certainly not the only appropriate term, but that's an option you may want to consider. These are other best practices that you may want to consider. So in terms of including sign languages in linguistics and including deaf linguists in linguistics, when you're hosting a presentation, instead of saying oral presentation, consider the use of the term stage presentation. Because in terms of what humans do to communicate, we don't always only speak. We're able to use tactile communication. And being more general includes more modes of communication. In terms of native speakers, that doesn't necessarily apply to the deaf community. However, it is very important for me to note there has been a hot debate about the term native speaker referring to the gold standard of what is considered good language. And people have problematized that association. However, in deaf communities, many deaf children are born into a non-deaf family, and they don't acquire sign language right away. They may not acquire that until later on in life, or perhaps not at all. So because of deaf signing communities, age of acquisition for sign language can vary. When you're talking about truly, purely native speakers, you are excluding a huge proportion of deaf and signing communities. So that's something to bear in mind. And that leads me to the presentation I'm doing today. And the whole point is that not all deaf people sign. Honestly, most deaf people don't sign. So that's something to bear in mind. And again, I can't emphasize enough that human beings will make use of whatever modality they can access in order to communicate. And that can vary depending on a person's physical abilities, their identity, the communities to which they belong. So again, there is no one monolithic representation of deaf people, deaf communities, signing communities, and the ways in which people choose to communicate. One reason that most deaf people may not sign is that their families don't sign. And that brings us to the topic of language deprivation, which is a very hot topic in deaf communities. And if I may elaborate on that, basically, when a child is born, the family will expect that they have a shared experience in every way, a shared condition, a shared way of being with the infant in terms of their physical being and their access to language and their worldviews. But that's not the case when a deaf child is born to a hearing family, not always anyway. There are various different ways and approaches for how to raise deaf children and give them access to communication. And I won't get into that right now. But what I will say is that many deaf children do exhibit a delayed acquisition of language. And I think that you can also use this citation if you'd like to learn more about language deprivation. So a lot of people think about who are hearing, think about their access to language as a human right, and they take it for granted. However, in deaf communities and signing communities, that's not our lived experience. Okay, and that leads me to my last point on this slide. Maybe some of you have seen discussed in the literature in different language communities, the use of deaf as uppercase D or lowercase d, deaf. It's kind of like Wesley Leonard's linguistics with a capital L versus lowercase l. If someone is considered capital D deaf, that means they feel a cultural affinity and the practices of the deaf community, whereas lowercase d deaf really refers to a person's ability to hear and is more of a medical view of a person. Some deaf scholars have proposed that that binary distinction doesn't actually accurately represent the identities of people within deaf and signing communities, and it doesn't include all ways of being for a person who is deaf. I know for myself that I sometimes identify as capital D deaf or lowercase d deaf, but I can tell you as a person who is deaf, I feel that it is very important for my identity that I would use uppercase D deaf. But by doing so, I don't mean to exclude those who don't identify as uppercase D deaf. And honestly, I feel that this is a very individual, subjective decision that a person needs to make. These are just a few things that I think you should keep in mind when you are considering best practices for inclusion. There's one more post that I would like to share with you. How can we make language theory more inclusive? This was written, a blog written by some linguists. And in terms of our diversity, how it is that we can account for our shared experiences. And that's been our total theme for this presentation, the different ways of being. How can we acknowledge, how can we honor, and how can we discuss different ways of being without othering or discounting or denigrating those ways of being? Oh, so that was the information I was hoping to share with you today. And we've just touched the tip of the iceberg with the information I shared. I hope that this provokes some thought of including deaf people and sign languages in linguistics. And I hope that you've noticed that there were some parallel experiences with both Kendra and Wesley's presentations. And as we expect, there will be with Kirby's presentation next. So you may notice here on my title, the emoji of the two hands. And that's my way of, actually rebelling a little bit against the traditional written English format of communicating in text. And I feel that that includes my best practices, my linguistic practice of using emoji with text. So you can think of that as wonderful, or it could also mean the cited deaf applause sign, or it could mean finished as well.
Kat is saying, okay, that was amazing. I was just absolutely taken away by your presentation. I loved it, start to finish. So, Julie's saying, I would like to make one short, oh, go ahead. Okay, may I go ahead? I'd just like to make a short remark. You know, watching myself, I cringe here and there, like thinking, oh, I could have said something else or added something else. I'd like to apologize because the transition was quite fast at sometimes. And so if you didn't get a chance to read and I just took over and started signing, please let me know. I can always include that following the presentation. Was it okay? Can everybody see me okay? On my end, it's freezing a bit. Kat said, you're fine here. And Kat is saying, now we have time for questions. we have about 20 minutes. We'll leave it to an open discussion. You can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or write it in the chat. I'd like to give you those options. Okay. Julie's saying, you know, I thought of one more thing I would like to add, just comment on. Okay. When I was thinking about going to grad school for linguistics, and at the time, and I think for the rest of my life, you guys can agree, it really developed my identity as a deaf person. And I'm sure you can relate. You know, at first I went in there a little thrown off, and then, you know, I grew up in Chicago. It's a good thing. I forgot to mention, I am from Chicago. So hello, Chicago people. I too am from Chicago. Grew up in that. I should have said that to begin with. And I was thinking, oh, I forgot to say that. I grew up in Lake Forest. Ugh, I know. But I went to a mainstream school with a deaf program at Hersey High School. It has a huge deaf program there. Anyway, point being, I grew up mainstreamed education, and my access to the deaf community was not so much growing up. By the time I went to college, oh, absolutely, that deaf exposure was great. I got the time to assess myself. What does it mean to be deaf? And at Gallaudet, I didn't consider it to be a good school for me. You know, I was a mainstream girl. I mean, now, obviously, I don't agree with that when I first started, but when I went to grad school, I applied several different places. The University of Chicago was one of them. I met with Dr. Mufwene,
Yes.
and I remember Dr. Mufwene. I'm not sure, you know, sign languages, and the doctor was saying, yeah, so, you know, we want to get you involved in every way. And I was just thrown aback. I was thinking, wow, you know, this is one of the first linguists in the field that I met. And immediately I felt just completely involved and included. And now, you know, 20 years, by the way, since that, what happened was I decided to hold off on grad school, and I went and I joined the Peace Corps. So my life went in one direction for a while, which I thought was just a pivotal experience, absolutely. But I should have added that too about myself, about Dr. Mufwene. So thank you for letting me be involved today as part of this workshop series.
By the way, I'm flattered to be mentioned. And I remember that meeting in my office, and you came with your parents, and you had your interpreter. And one of the things I said, I think, was, you know, how embarrassing it is that here we have to speak through an interpreter. And I said, if you come and have to take classes with me, I will have to learn sign language. I was disappointed that you didn't come to Chicago.
Yes. There's still time, right? Still time. Kat is saying, okay, I see in the chat that we have a question from Brianna.
Oh, there I am. You can see.
Sorry, as the host, I don't have the raise hand function, so I had to type in the chat that I have a question. Yeah, so I was wondering, a lot of times in like introduction to linguistics classes, professors want to make sure to include more examples of both spoken and signed languages. And as a hearing person that is not a fluent signer, I was wondering like if there are best practices for incorporating examples from ASL that doesn't do so in an exoticizing way, at least for including examples of African American English, like as a white person, I don't usually read the example aloud. I have the students read it, but I was wondering, like for sign languages, is it best to include a video of signers or to like that sort of thing? So that's my question.
Can everybody see me clear? It's just so dark in this room. One moment. Okay. Always a great question. That's something to consider when I was making this speech, actually. This presentation was quite hard for me to do. Ordinarily, when I develop presentations, I just start typing and I go for it. And that shape just develops as I go on throughout the presentation. But with this one, I was trying to like mold it and I really could not find just one shape that I was going for because everything is so dense and complicated. So I left out a lot of information. There are so many practices that come from each set of communities and populations. You know, what you do comes from your experience based on other people's experience. So there is no, one deaf way to do a certain thing. I was thinking perhaps one way is you can ask a deaf interpreter, deaf researcher, or a deaf professor, what is your preference? Are your preferred resources? Do you prefer videos? Do you prefer books or blogs? And then once you discuss that with them, you can have that ready and then view it for showing. Sometimes if you talk about politics or a party, phonology, you may want to talk about a part instead of the sound or the sign because you already know how to produce that, and that's fine. Most of you already know. I understand most of you might not be as fluent as signers as other deaf people, but it's evidence that's there, that's okay. If you would like to show something like language practices or skill set, then obviously you would show the video for that. Also, take caution. I know the online world is a beautiful, wonderful thing, but it's also can be terrible. A massive tool for deaf people is that YouTube. I remember there was one student or a person who was just picking up signs and was just signing away and got this massive following. And the deaf people are like, no, don't do that. What are you doing? I know, looking for ASL, a large amount of people want to do it. But Google, YouTube is an immediate result. And you can think, oh, like that's what I get. That's what I should follow. And there's no science behind that. And so I understand that we have compiled a list, and I believe I showed it on my slides. Maybe it went by too fast, but we have a list of resources available for you to use if you are in need of more resources. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I'm popping in now.
Yeah, it's a Friday afternoon. I know it's been a long Zoom week for everybody, myself included. I'm thinking, stop talking already. If that's what you think too, I completely understand. Okay, I see.
Hi. So I was wondering if you would speak to, so in your presentation, you discussed the importance of making the academic research that one does in general and then what does on sign languages more accessible for the wider communities. And I was wondering if you could speak to your thoughts on like the best places, the best avenues to disseminate that research and the best ways to share it so that it reaches the most people and I guess is most accessible in that way.
I'm sorry, the video moved and the interpreter moved on my screen. I just want to make sure that I understand your question. Okay, you saw in my presentation, or heard whatever heard in my presentation that I was speaking about academic research is not accessible for a wide variety of people. And so an online format is used instead. So are you asking me about my advice on how to disseminate information, specifically research? I just want to
Yeah.
make sure I understand that clearly. Okay, great. I think that we're fortunate, we have shifted our focus to the value of different ways of gathering that information, having that knowledge. And it was brought up in Wesley's speech presentation. I would recommend that book for I would just recommend books in general. But I'd also like to recognize that online platforms nowadays, for signing people, they have more deaf people placed in there. For DSDJ, they also have ACADAFIC, academic, and then websites where you can include both written English text as well as signed language.
Cool.
So these are all good ways to disseminate that research, but I think that what the problem is with online platforms is that you have those same people, the same issues of trust from various resources. It's better to trust that a certain institution has a process, like academic, ASDJ, and JASL. I'll spell it out in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, those are great resources.
Okay, I also see another question.
So we have
Okay, so we'll take 2 more questions, Kat's saying, and then we're good. And Julie says, yes, we are good with that.
And 1 second, Charisse, let me fix the spotlighting. I'm sorry, I don't want to move.
Okay, and then Kat, I'm not sure that Julie can see me. I just want to check in with her on that. This is Trayman speaking.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So the question that I had was more so on the side of, first of all, thank you for your talk. Let me back up a second. It was great. And the question that I had was more so on the side of thinking about inclusion in terms of our requirements for linguistic departments. So I know when I was an undergrad, I'd wanted to do my language requirement. One of them I wanted to fulfill using American Sign Language, but it was something that I was told I couldn't do because, well, no one's here to really support that, was the critique, well, not the critique, but that was the response. And, you know, one of them was also a reading requirement, so it couldn't count in that aspect. And so I just wonder about how we, now being on the other side, how can we create more inclusive requirements when it comes to thinking, yeah, sign languages?
Wow, what an amazing question. I think part of the issue here is resources. Am I freezing? Can you all see me? Are we good? Am I good? Kate's saying, I can see you, you're not freezing. So, I think part of the problem really is related to resources, especially in particular to signed languages, because signing communities are inherently so small. So, I'm reticent to say, anything about requirements because we don't want to set up these systems that are so strict and then people's research and work is ignored. So, it's an amazing question, but I'm not sure. I think by including diverse people in any avenue possible and providing that recognition that people are seen and represented, I just can't think of a specific example right now or a way to resolve that, but it's an amazing question.
Okay, we'll have Jason go next. I'm going to spotlight them.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk. Yeah, I'm curious how to resolve this tension where it would be great to include multimedia and things like abstracts for conferences, animated GIFs and things like that. But it's hard to do with the current technology, and especially with this emphasis on anonymity. So I feel like there's this tension between, making a website or something which you could put a link to where you could include the animations that you want, and which would just by necessity be really hard to do anonymously. But how do we get the best practices for, say, conferences to say, like, okay, maybe like allow people to be slightly less anonymous if it lets them put the content in that they need? I feel like that's a hard battle to fight. So do you have any clever ideas about how we move the field?
Yeah, that's something I think about all the time. You're right. It's such an interesting tension, as you said, because in our community, in the deaf and signing communities, we require seeing people's faces. And then I know that there is a hot discussion about anonymity. I'm an IRB chair at Gallaudet University, so I totally get that. It's an issue that we often face. So one practice that I've employed is when, I didn't do it today because I knew we were already going to be online, but when we have in-person conferences and whenever that might be at the next opportunity in the future, one of my slides actually says I give people permission to share on Twitter, post tweets, or share pictures. And so that also implies, when it is appropriate and when it is inappropriate to disseminate that information. I make that very explicit, and especially privileged people, who are just willing to be up there on stage, but maybe there are people who don't add to the conversation because they prefer to be anonymous. So that can impact those interactions. But, we can use technology as, we can use technology, we can put emojis on people's faces so we obscure their identity. That would probably be best. But that's one way that I've seen people obscuring their identity in photographs. And in my work with the ASL Sign Bank, sometimes we'll upload a video and a person will say, I don't want that video uploaded, or I have to ask again for someone's permission, or I will have to sign myself and upload an image of myself to protect their anonymity. Trying to think of another instance, but I lost my train of thought. But you're right, that is an issue. And I think technology will lead the shift and it'll give us more options. And we can hopefully include more people in this conversation. Especially about like those signing gloves and things like that. We don't want technology to go that way. But we do need to have a seat at the table so we can lead those discussions. And we were talking about like how we could make different allowances to preserve people's anonymity. But yeah, I do appreciate your comment. Thanks, everyone. Do we have time for one more? Oh, I can't see you, Kat. Hang on, let me let me find you. And Kat's saying, I'm here. We do have one more question. Do you have time for one more? Julie's saying, yes, please. I'm here and I'm happy to take that question. Okay, great. This is the interpreter speaking. If you don't mind, Diane, I couldn't see you. I didn't realize you were signing your question and I had to find you. Do you mind to please start again so I can interpret for the hearing audience? Thank you. Hello. Diane saying hello, Julie. This was an excellent talk. And I wanted to comment, to connect with Charisse and her comment and her question of how we could best set up American Sign Language to fulfill the foreign language requirements for education here. For the past 30 years, we've been working on that. Purdue University has that set up, and now University of Chicago has as well. We think it's very important to sort of remove the barriers due to the literature. And it's important also to understand that American Sign Language is, that the complexity and the intricacies of American Sign Language, for those who may not be aware of that. And if there are grad students who have or who are required to learn ASL for their work, then it is very important that they can have that experience of socializing, with their deaf colleagues. And if they are not learning from deaf colleagues in the field, then they should not be able to join that academic community. So the use of that academic language is extremely vital. So if a student is expecting that they will conduct work in a community that's using ASL, then they should have had that interaction and that training with American Sign Language, and in particular at the academic level. So now here at U Chicago, we do have such a program set up and students are able to take advantage of that. And Julie's saying that's great. This is Kat. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry we went over a little bit. If perhaps you have follow-up questions or comments, you can email those. But I just wanted to offer you a heartfelt thank you, Julie. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Thank you to our interpreters. Thank you so much for everyone who has worked hard to make this event a success. Thank you, Julie saying thanks everyone. Thank you.